Andrew Rawson, the Chief Learning Officer and co-founder of Traliant. So Andrew Rawson is the Chief Learning Officer and co-founder of Traliant, an innovator in online workplace compliance training, including diversity training, sexual harassment prevention training, and other essential topics to help organizations create a respectful, inclusive workplace culture, which has been a huge pillar to today's conversation. So Andrew is going to talk to us about people remember stories, not facts, the key to building an effective training program. I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Andrew, and have you take it from here. Oh, Andrew, I cannot hear you. I can see you. Let me just pause for a
How about,
moment.
there we go. How about now?
I
Is that
can hear
better?
you now. Thank you, Andrew.
Okay, and you can see my screen okay?
Screen looks good. The presentation looks good. Full screen and everything.
Great. So good afternoon, everyone, or good morning on the West Coast. So most of the people talk about the tough part about the world of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is the content itself and what needs to be communicated and how to go about doing that. I'm going to focus on what our experience is as a learning provider, what the techniques are, the tools and techniques that make for an effective training course, right? Because the best material in the world, if it's not presented correctly, doesn't resonate with people and it doesn't stick. One of the themes I'll come back to is that people remember stories, not facts, and I'll give some examples about how we can take the content and turn it into really effective material. So, you can ask questions during my presentation, and then Ashley will, or Charlene, sorry, will she'll either interrupt or we'll get to them at the end, but we will get to your questions. So the first thing I'm going to cover is discuss how fundamentally diversity, equity, and inclusion training and also prevention of sexual harassment training are fundamentally different than any other type of training. Most training, employee training, is skills-based training, but this is really about behavior, and that's fundamentally different, right? When you're testing, if you want to know what someone knows how to create a formula in Excel, if they get the question right on the test, you can be pretty sure they know how to do it. Just because someone gives you the right answer on the test doesn't mean they're going to behave that way. And the approach to learning, we think, has got to be much different because of that. Then I'll also talk about how you can kind of curate a collection of courses into kind of an effective framework, because that's the other thing is you have all this great training, and what do? Do you assign it to people all at once, or should you have kind of a learning path, and how do you handle that? I'll talk about some of the things that we do with our clients that have proved to be effective and welcomed by the end users. And another important concept to keep in mind is the motivation to take this kind of training is relatively low, meaning most people on their own would not elect to do this. So that puts a higher burden on the way the training is implemented, because you don't have such a willing audience. So we want to make we want to put a little ketchup on the broccoli if we have to, and that's a little bit of an exaggeration. But certainly with prevention of sexual harassment, that's traditionally been true. There's more interest in contributing to a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce now than there has ever been. So that may be a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's still important to keep in mind that most people are not voluntarily taking this training. And then part of this is providing you a framework. You can structure your own program and how to integrate your key topics into it. And then I'll show you some of the techniques that we've implemented that have proven to be popular with end users. So first, to give a little bit of background on how the world has evolved. And it's evolved dramatically, starting with Harvey Weinstein in October of 2017, and really the birth of the Me Too movement. And then it kind of accelerated into hyperdrive with the murder of George Floyd, which was just a year ago. It was just May of 20. And what this graph shows is the horizontal axis is training that's considered to be must-have on the left, And whether that was by best practice or legally required in some cases, to the far right is kind of the nice to have. And the vertical axis shows that what companies were thinking about in terms of risk management. And until Harvey Weinstein, which again is just 4 years ago now, most people thought of the sexual harassment prevention training as really just risk management. There was only California and Connecticut had state laws back then requiring this type of training, and the training wasn't even supposed to be effective. It was supposed to give you a good defense in the event of a lawsuit. And diversity, equity, and inclusion training was really kind of an afterthought. And what's happened is there's been these bubbles are moving to the left and they're moving up, meaning the risks of not doing this training effectively are increasing, and the belief that these are all must-have topics is certainly growing as well. So this is a huge shift in things. Yes, the demand for diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And by the way, just to talk about, which we like to do, we like to talk about kind of the elephant in the room. A year ago, starting in June, when there was this, we saw this because we're a provider of this type of training, when we saw this huge spike in demand for diversity, equity, and inclusion training, most off-the-shelf training, including ours back then, kind of ignored racism. The kind of implicit was racism isn't a problem, that we can move on to the higher concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, the George Floyd murder just was right in everyone's face proof that and other related events is just prima facie evidence that racism is a huge problem. And I'll show you when I demonstrate some of the things that we do that how you can being candid with people, particularly in training, is a great way to win them over. And I'll give you some examples about being the worst thing in the world is wagging your finger at people. No one learns from that. Children don't learn from that. Adults don't learn from that. So I'll get into that in a few minutes, but it's important to see how that's things are evolving. So here are some key, really key concepts. People do remember stories, not facts, because knowledge transfer does not correlate to behavior. I am confident that Harvey Weinstein and all the other stories that broke after that about these incredibly public figures, all men, frankly, behaving badly and illegally, all would have scored very well in any type of testing. So just knowledge transfer doesn't correlate to behavior. That's really one of the key things to remember. You cannot rely on just knowledge-based tests to determine that your training's been effective. Another key concept is one of the worst insults that someone can make about training on these topics is that, when I'm finished, I didn't know what to do. Like, I learned a bunch of stuff, but what am I supposed to do? So it's really about focusing on the behavior you want people to emulate. That's a very important concept. Not just teaching them the definitions of things, but give them examples of what you want them to do and not to do. And behavior-based training is much more effective than knowledge-based training, because when you do behavior-based training, you're telling stories, and that's what people remember. 99% of the time you see somebody in Washington, someone in Congress holding a press conference, there's going to be a big easel next to them and a line with a graph with a single line on it. It's either going to go up at a 45-degree angle or down at a 45-degree angle. Why? Because graphs are stories. Tables of numbers are facts, but graphs are stories. People remember stories. Things are getting better or things are getting worse. So that's a really important concept, is remember that you want to tell stories because that's what people will remember. And that goes to the next bullet point, is you want to focus on what people need to do, not what they need to know. And I realize it's kind of the same thing said a different way. And then finally, remember, good stories have tension. The definition of drama is tension. And the way that we've found the only way, well, let's not be, again, to give you an example of being candid and talking about the elephant in the room, nobody's training was going to change Harvey Weinstein's behavior. So if someone's a psychopath, training's not going to change their behavior. But there are people in the middle whose behavior can be influenced. And we like it when people quibble about a story in our training, because that means they're engaged. And we like when people write to us and say, well, I don't think it should have been this, and why is this person the bad guy, and why is this person never the good guy, and so on. So it's good if people give you that type of feedback in training, because it means they're engaged. If you don't hear from them, it doesn't mean that it worked. It means that they might just have not been engaged. So it's okay to have a little tension in your training. And then finally, part of that is showing the consequences of the right and wrong behavior. We believe, and our practice has been, that the only way to really influence people's behavior is to have them want to change it. And by holding up a mirror to people about the consequences of their actions is the only way that our surveys have shown that people are willing to change. Wagging fingers at people doesn't work. I mentioned that earlier. It's reciting laws doesn't do it. Pointing to your policies doesn't do it. But showing the impact of their behavior, both positive and negative, is the best way to actually drive behavioral change in any organization. So let me dive into a little bit about how we kind of organize some of these key topics. Certainly, diversity, inclusion, equity, sensitivity are all kind of at the core, as is anything around, prevention of discrimination and harassment are really core topics. And there generally should be core training around those, meaning that you're covering your company's policy with examples of what people should and shouldn't do. But then the supporting pieces, which were never that popular until the last year, are about the things that prevent us from being inclusive in our work, or the things that we should do to prevent the things that we should do to create a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable environment. So unconscious bias, right? That's about the things that we don't realize we're doing that make us less inclusive or drive us to making discriminatory decisions when we don't really mean to. Microaggressions is probably the most popular topic in here, in that people see themselves, and that's always important in training. I'll get into an examples of that in a few minutes. When people see themselves in their training, it tends to resonate with them. That said, hey, that's me. I've done that. Oh my God, I didn't realize that. And the reason that happens with microaggressions so frequently is because microaggressions have a wide array of motivations, and frequently it's somebody's being just uneducated, right? Making a comment about, no, where are you from? No, where are you from really? It's not necessarily meant as a discriminatory slight, even though that's in fact what it is. So when people see themselves in that type of training, they respond well to it. Bystander intervention has grown in importance, because the realization is that while you may not be able to stop every bad actor from misbehaving in the workplace, that there are many people who see it and do the classic look at their shoes. Somebody else is going to speak up. I don't want to get involved. The biggest concern, of course, is retaliation. So bystander intervention is worthy of its own individual training to remind people that they should speak up and they are doing the right thing. And finally, cultural competency, which I really don't like that term. It's a little bit cultural intimacy is a better term. We use cultural competency because that's the kind of the buzzword out there. But I don't like cultural competency because, to me, it's a little condescending that I should deign to understand your culture because I'm going to understand you somehow. While cultural intimacy implies more of humility, that we're all equal, and now I'm understanding you in a way I didn't before, and you're understanding me, and that's, like the UN in their charter said, people misunderstand each other because of language and culture, and if we can break that barrier down and become culturally intimate, then we're much more likely to achieve the kind of workplace that we all want to come to every day. So let me talk about how we kind of integrate some of these things. And there's on the left-hand side, talks about what was historically the approach to this type of training, which was check the box once a year and you're done. I don't, but I feel like saying when I'd love for us to say in our marketing material for our company, if you're interested in just checking the box, we're not for you. It's just too obnoxious, but that's kind of the thought is, right? We don't want to do that. Because what happens is in any type of training, if you do it once a year, this is the forgetting curve, and this is a well-documented phenomena that goes back, to the beginning of whenever computer-based training was invented. That over time people forget, and whether it's knowledge or behavior, they tend to forget when it goes away. Also, because I'm stressing that diversity, equity, and inclusion is behavior-based training, it really is important that you can't tell people something's important to your organization, talk about it in January, and not mention it for the rest of the year, because the tone from the top is not aligned with the deed from the top, right? If you're saying it's really important, then you've got to weave it in. You've got to weave a curriculum into your training program in your organization. So on the right-hand side is a more effective way of dealing with the forgetting curve, where smaller amounts of training more frequently, training that doesn't insult the user's intelligence so that they're not dreading it every time, is a much more effective way of keeping people on top of it's a much more effective way of getting your message out there. And I guess the key point is that when I say the right message at the right frequency, just the fact that you're saying it on a routine basis, the cadence itself is part of the message. So at the beginning of the year, when you come out and you say, this is really important to us that we move to a more equitable and just and inclusive workforce, and you're repeating that message, not daily, but weekly, quarterly, monthly, just the fact of the repetition, that's part of the message. Also, you can't underestimate the power of reinforcing messages over time. And two other important points are that very important to train management and supervisors first. One of the things we observed early on in my career was that if you train everybody simultaneously, when a person goes to their supervisor and has a question, if that person hasn't seen the training yet, it's impossible for them to really, really, really be supportive. So the training goes out to everybody on Monday, and somebody is diligent and they're interested in the topic actually, and they dive into the training on Tuesday, and on Wednesday they go to their supervisor and say, I got a question. How would I handle this situation? Because in the training it said this, but I thought that. If the supervisor hasn't taken the training, their response is typically, I don't know, I haven't seen the training yet. And that kind of undoes a lot of the good. Your frontline messengers are the management and supervisors. And not only do we suggest that you give them a head start on any training, but something we've learned. And by the way, if you hear anything in my talk today that you go like, oh, that's really smart, I guarantee you it came from one of our customers. And so not only did we learn from them to train management supervisors on board first, but even more importantly, some of our largest clients have taken the diversity, equity, and inclusion training, and before they even trained their senior people, they went to their most senior management, gave them the training first as just a Word document, and said, we'd like you to review this and like your input, because there's nothing that is more organization specific than DE&I training. You can have identical organizations in terms of their geography, their industry, their demographics, the age of the organization, and so on, and they'll be at different places on their journey. So by getting the senior management's input first, you get their buy-in, because you're going to learn things from them. They're going to say, I disagree with this, or why is this there? And then if you engage with them, now you've got an army of supporters. And I would suggest that you plan on including a broader group of stakeholders in reviewing your material than you might normally for other types of training. But in the world of diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion, it's so organization specific that casting a wide net and getting a lot of feedback, from your employee resource groups, that can be critical if you have those. Um, Making sure that everyone's voice is heard is really important. One thing I learned very early on in life is that everybody likes their own cooking. So if you have input from people, then they see it reflected in the training, they're going to be supporters, and that's what you need, because there is a group component to this, right? If people are dismissive, then it doesn't then that bad karma spreads. But if people are supportive, that spreads too. The other benefit about doing things over time is it gives you the great ability to listen and adjust. Listening is obviously a difficult skill, and particularly in this world, as particularly in the remote environment that virtually all of us are working in to a greater or lesser extent today. But when you have a curriculum that's laid out over a number of months, when you get feedback early on, take the feedback and adjust. And that's one of the best things you can do to ensure that your program is really effective over time. So here's an example of kind of a training calendar we see people use, where the goal is to align the deed from the top, right? We said this is important. That's the tone from the top. Now the deed from the top is, what we did. We laid out an 8-month program that we're going to do this type of training in. I will also suggest that if you have any type of learning technology that allows you to set up a learning path or a curriculum, that, and again, just things we've learned, don't set it up so that when someone finishes one course, they immediately get assigned the next one, because people are smart, and what you're training them on is your reward for finishing one course is you get another one assigned. So it is much better to keep your training set around specific dates and not relative dates. And the idea here is that you need to mix not just your training, which are the ones where there's titles, but your communication, right? Your programs that you need to look out over the course of a year, or in this case, 8 months. This is something that we worked on with one of our clients. But put together a program and publish that. Let people know what's going on. People are much more receptive to when you're implementing something they know about than just, when is this going to end? How often do we get these things? Let them know. I mean, people appreciate that. It's that concept I talked about in, cultural humility. It's humility in, training people the way you want to be trained. And if you've got a whole curriculum coming out, let them know what it is. And in part of onboarding, if this is something that happens when people are onboarded, let them know as part of it. Here's what we're doing. Here's our commitment to educating everybody about what we want people to do. And we want people to understand the commitment that we're making, and we want you to reciprocate by wholeheartedly embracing it. And people are much more likely to do that when they know what's coming on. So let me show you some of the things that we do, and they're all good examples of things that you can implement to a greater or lesser extent in your own training. I've got some examples here. One thing is, in terms of that candor being very much a very powerful way of winning people over that are, cynical about the nature of the training. If you talk about what people are thinking about, and I've got an example there I'll show you, it really wins people over. We got tremendous feedback on what I'm about to show you. You want to be careful not to insult the learner's intelligence. That's one of the great criticisms of this type of training. You tell me what I know, just give me the test already, will you? And also, not to oversell the impact of the training, right? You're trying to show people the right and wrong behavior, but we're not suggesting that we're going to save the world by this. We're just trying to do our part of it to make it a little more diverse, a little more equitable, a little more inclusive society. So let's take a look at how we, you know what, did I share my audio here? I'm going to stop for 1 second. I don't think I shared my audio. Give me 1 second. I'm sorry here. Yeah. No, I did. Sorry about that. Are we back? You can see my screen again, I hope. So now you can, this is the opening of workplace diversity, sensitive, and inclusion training.
Welcome. I'm John, and I'll be your host today. The modern workplace is moving beyond simply respecting the legal boundaries of our discrimination and harassment laws, and is now embracing the principles of respect, diversity, and inclusion. This evolution.
We interrupt this diversity and inclusion training for a long overdue discussion on the big elephant in the room, racism. Many people find race to be a difficult subject.
So after George Floyd, when we added racism content to our training courses, we realized that that was the elephant in the room, that diversity, equity, inclusion training didn't typically address that. So by taking the course host, making it like the signal was being jammed and then, interrupting the broadcast, we got tremendous feedback. And then people said that, great, you're really kind of acknowledging the elephant in the room, and we talked about it. Anytime you can do that, if you've had incidents in your organizations, and there's all sensitive topics, but anything you can do in your training that breaks down that barrier of cynicism, that what is this training all about, really goes a long way to winning people over. And I can't emphasize that enough. The things that you can do to address that white elephant in the room, or your organization had some terrible problem with retaliation in years past or something, but finding a sensitive way to broach that topic, it's really, really important. And people respond incredibly well to that honesty. So that's one example.
Welcome. I'm John.
Another example is when we try to create training that appeals to the voyeur in all of us, right? Why is reality TV so popular? Because it's like, oh, I can't believe how dumb they are, or so glad that's not me. So by not making it about you better do this and you better not do that, by watching other people's train wreck, it really does draw people in. So that's part of the storytelling, not about them, but about showing it with other people. Also, to my point about being humble and being kind of modest in the approach, is you'll see that a lot of people, I said organizations are at different places on their journey. All of us as individuals are in different places on our journey. So acknowledging that you might already know this and other versions of that statement are really important in your training, because again, that wins people over. And also, I'm doing my bullet points out of sequence here. Defining jargon. One of the things that the worst things about jargon is when people hear it, because it's jargon, they feel like they should know, and then people don't want to ask because they feel like, oh, I really, if I don't know, that's terrible. So you get a lot of credit for defining jargon. Define what an employee reset, what an ERG is. Tell people what it is. Not everybody knows, but at the same time, balancing between, you might already know this. And here's an example of a video where someone's going through self-reflection about microaggressions, and I'll show you just a little bit of this. How are we doing on time?
We have about 9 minutes, Andrew.
Okay, great. So let's take a look at Ian here.
Hi, I'm Ian. I'm a little out of sorts right now. I just took a training on microaggressions. You may already be familiar with them. Microaggressions are subtle comments, sometimes intentional, sometimes not, that show prejudice against someone. Anyway, I didn't realize how much I didn't know.
So there we are. You might already know this, and then we define the jargon, right? That's helpful.
The first few examples were pretty obvious, right? Like, don't say, oh, you must be the diversity hire, or, wow, I didn't know someone your age knew about Twitter. But then I learned that some of the things I'd been saying, which I thought were no big deal, were actually offensive. I've put my foot in my mouth a lot, and I feel terrible. I can't imagine what my colleagues must be thinking. Like the time I met my colleague Nobuyuki, I didn't even try to pronounce his name. He told me his name, and I literally said, Noba what? That's quite a mouthful. Or the time I got confused and I introduced Lourdes as Mercedes. I was really surprised to learn that things that I had said, which I thought were compliments or small talk, were actually offensive.
So this is another point about, right, not all inappropriate behavior has a malicious intent behind it. And this is another way of winning people over by saying, right, so you didn't know that this was a bad thing to do. Here's why it's a bad thing to do. And we recognize that you didn't have malicious intent. So it's all part of winning people's hearts and minds, because when you do that, you have a chance of influencing their behavior.
Like when Eric crushed his presentation on the quarterly numbers, and I said, "Man, you are so articulate." And then there was the time that I told our director of marketing that she seemed so young that I mistook her for an intern. And then, of course, there was the time that I told Mark that I find him to be such an inspiration. And I will always cringe when I think about the time I asked Samir where he was from. This whole microaggressions thing has been a real eye-opener for me. Like I said, I have put my foot in my mouth a lot. And in these situations, I would have been better off not saying anything at all. But I am glad I know a little bit more about microaggressions now. I like my coworkers. I really do. And I certainly don't want to say things that will hurt them.
So that video embodies a lot of things I'm talking about, but and hopefully you found it like doing all the things that we wanted to do, about people seeing their own behavior, people saying that, I did this, it was well intentioned, but I realized why I shouldn't do it. That there's no finger wagging. It's all about watching Ian be the train wreck he is, and then that's what makes it kind of captivating. And it's all about stories. So those are some of the examples. So
Andrew, if I apologize, I was wrong about the number. We have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, so then let me just go and show you this. So, I'm saying with great confidence, that these techniques really work. And how do I know? We've got over 2 million course completions. For our bystander training alone, we have a net promoter score, meaning, that's on the score of 1 to 10, where you'd say, will you recommend this to a friend or colleague? Any scores over 50 are considered best in class. And the thing that's most encouraging is the people's self-reported response that how likely are they to apply the skills or behavior learned in this course. Almost 80% said very likely. Now, again, that's self-reported, and that's not quite the gold standard of effectiveness, which would be, survey a cohort before the training, survey a cohort afterwards. So we're working on that, but these are pretty good indications of how effective these techniques are. So that let's move on and see if there's some questions I can answer in the brief time we have left.
Yes, I'll pop on, Andrew. We actually just have some comments of people saying that the session was very insightful and that they learned a lot from the examples that you shared. One very quick question, if I could throw it in. I was just taking some notes, and I know that you were talking a lot about frequency of the training, and how has kind of the current climate with what's going on paired with the pandemic affected what that frequency of training looks like just currently for organizations? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, I can just tell you that people have been willing to do more training, because when people have been remote, it's just been, when you're working from your home every day, it's just easier to integrate the training into your day. People are eating lunch at their desk and they can watch the training when they're doing it. So we've definitely seen an increase in the frequency of training since everybody went remote.
Mm-hmm.